You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Roger, today talking about some of your top 10 things from 2024 in agricultural law and taxation, and today talking through number 10, 9, and 8. But before we do that, how does something get in your top 10?
Well, that's a good question, and I start each year when I do this, and I've done this for, roughly the past 25 to 30 years. I'm always into the cases and all the developments, tax and non-tax, just the straight agricultural law developments, as well as the tax developments every day. And so I have a pretty good feel for what are the really big, important ones in terms of their impact on the agricultural sector in general. And usually when I start pulling my list down, I can get it narrowed down to 40 to 50 big developments, and then I have to thin it down from there. And what I end up with often will be major federal cases, often U.S. Supreme Court cases, that I think will have the biggest impact nationwide, or have a major impact on a particular issue for lots of farmers and ranchers in a particular area of the country. So that's how I try to narrow it down. But there are so many developments. It's such a dynamic area of the law in terms of the application of farmers and ranchers. It is difficult to pick the top 10, but often the top 2 or 3 pretty much surface and sort themselves out pretty easily.
And coming in at number 10, involving the Rio Grande Compact, and what was that?
Well, this goes back actually historically to 1938. That's when Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas entered into what's known as the Rio Grande Compact, and Congress approved it in 1939. And that was an agreement where the states were equitably apportioning the waters of the Rio Grande Basin amongst them. And under that compact, Colorado committed to deliver a certain amount of water to the New Mexico state line, and they also put in, at that time, a minimum quality standard. And back in 1939, when the compact was approved, of course, there wasn't as much groundwater pumping as there is now. Agriculture has developed. There's been other developments in the area, and that impacts the surface flow in the Rio Grande. And actually beginning back in the 1950s, that groundwater pumping significantly increased. Well, it's that interconnectedness between the surface water in the Rio Grande and the groundwater that decreased the actual amount of the surface water in the Rio Grande Basin that flowed to Texas. And so you fast forward several decades, and in 2014, Texas sued New Mexico for allowing the Rio Grande's water reserves to be channeled away for its use, which deprived, Texas claimed, of its equal share in the river's resources. And this got into litigation, of course, and in 2018, the federal government said, hey, we need to be a party, and the Supreme Court agreed to that because a certain amount of that water was to go to Mexico under a treaty. And there were some Indian tribes that also had an interest in the water. And the Constitution does require, this is Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, it does require the states to send this to Congress, and Congress has to approve when the federal government has an interest.
And did this couple of states get in trouble for not getting it through Congress?
Yeah, they kind of ignored what the Supreme Court said in 2018, and they went ahead and came up with their own revision to the compact, and they changed some of the diversion points and so forth, and the federal government objected to that. And it went back before the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 2024, the U.S. Supreme Court said, you can't do that, states. We told you in 2018 you've got to involve the Congress, and they didn't do so, and the states thought they could do this without congressional approval. Of course, they want the rights to be able to allocate that water amongst them, and the court said, no, you can't, because the federal government does have an interest in that water.
And so where are we at in 2025 with this case?
Well, we're back to a special master. What happens in these cases, these don't go to juries. This is set up such that you have an individual, an expert, and here it's a retired federal district court judge or federal court of appeals judge that's designated as the special master who acts as a one-person jury to try to figure out what is a proper allocation of this water. And so the court assigned this case to the special master, and then he'll provide his findings, and those findings then will have to be presented to Congress to act on. But that's where this is at. And I really think this is a big deal across the country, Shelby, because a lot of the water compacts are going to be amongst states in the western part of the United States where it's more arid. And in a lot of those areas, you have federal lands and you have interests of the federal government. So these states are not going to have the ability to just enter into agreements on their own. They're going to have to get congressional approval.
What came in as number 9 of your top 10?
Number 9 is the Public Lands Rule, which the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, published a new rule in May of 2024, and it's part of the previous administration's effort to conserve at least 30% of U.S. lands and waters by 2030. And it's projected to apply to about 245 million acres of public lands, which is about a tenth of all U.S. land area. And really, the bottom line on this one, Shelby, is that it would restrict grazing rights on the federal lands. And so it has created quite a firestorm out west because it really prioritizes land conservation through restoration and mitigation by restricting grazing on public lands. And it's the ranchers out west that need access to the public lands to run a profitable business. Again, this is because the federal government owns so much of the land out west, and grazing rights are important on those public lands. So this is tied up in the courts. There are multiple court cases that have been filed challenging these rules.
So how does this move forward?
Well, we'll see. Again, we'll see what the courts say on this. There are several cases that have been filed, big cases out in Utah, as well as in Wyoming, and also in Alaska. So we'll get different court rulings on this. Plus, we may see a change in the emphasis of the federal government on this. They may pull back the rules in 25 just with a change in administration and a change in policy. So we'll see what happens.
And number 8 of the top 10 are takings cases that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the first one involving a highway that was put in.
Yeah, these takings cases, these are big, and really all these developments 10, 9, and 8 deal with property rights in one way or another. And we had a series of important takings cases in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And 30 years ago, I was talking a lot about property rights. And we had 2 more of these cases this year that follow up on those 3 that we had over 30 years ago. And the first case was out of Texas. We had a farmer that had his farming operation, his ranching operation down on the Gulf of America. And the state of Texas came in and redid a road. And in their process of reconstructing a highway, they ended up turning that highway into a dam. And so when the tropical storms occurred, the water would no longer drain into the Gulf. And it left his farm flooded for days. It destroyed his crops, killed his cattle. And they sued, the farming family sued the state of Texas to get paid for the taking. And the state of Texas says, well, you can't sue us because that clause is not self-executing. And so they end up in federal court, gets all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, yes, they can. It's not really a taking. It's called an inverse condemnation action brought under state law. So they do get their day in court on this one to get compensated for the damage that the state allegedly caused them.
And so they haven't had their day in court and haven't figured out what that's going to look like yet?
Well, they're trying to settle that with the state, and the issue is what are the damages that they're owed. But they will get something out of this.
And what was the second case involving takings?
Well, the second one was out in California, and this was an individual that wanted to build a modest residential home kind of midway between Sacramento, California, and Lake Tahoe. So maybe some listeners have been driven on that route. It's very beautiful. And the county said, well, that's fine. You can build your home there, but we want $24,000 from you as a traffic impact mitigation fee before you can put your home up. And this was just going to be a manufactured home on a lot. This was nothing fancy. But he paid the fee and then sued to challenge its constitutionality under the Fifth Amendment. And the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled in its favor. And they said, these types of exactions the government cannot do. That is a taking, and you can't do that. So he's going to get his money back, that $24,000.
What does this case mean for others?
Well, it means that local governments can't overreach and attempt to generate revenue. And this is just an extraction, an extra fee that they laid on, basically saying, yeah, we'll give you your permit to improve that lot, put your home on there, but we want a traffic mitigation fee. And no, the takings clause applies to that. You're taking their money without any type of benefit coming back. And so that is impermissible.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Again, thanks for having me, Shelby. Appreciate it.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. I will link his blog article with these top 10 stories from 2024 in today's show notes on agtoday.net.